Hello, viewer. Welcome to today's episode of Women's View. I'm your host, Anne Morimi. And in the event that you want to send us a message, you can SMS us on 21144. Today is a lovely day. The weather is great. And I want to give a chance to my co host to introduce herself. Hi, Lillian.
Hi, Anne. Hi, everyone. It's so good to be together again. Today, we have an exciting topic and an exciting host. But before that, my name is Lillian Kamau, and I'm very happy to be here. Karibuni.
So, Lillian, thank you so much. As you can see, I'm outdoors. Thanks to
Yeah.
you. No more zooming when I'm indoors because we've got great weather in Nairobi and the quality of the picture is so much better, as you told me yesterday.
Yeah. You look amazing, and it does something to your skin when you're outdoors.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Looks
We learn
amazing.
every day. Thank you, girl. How has your week been so far?
My week has been really good. Grateful to God.
So, guys, today we've got another guest joining us all the way from the UK. I love technology and what it has made us be able to do. So, we're going to be discussing something very interesting, spotting Mr. Wrong. And we have an expert to join us and help us figure out how to tell this is the wrong guy. And the aim is not to just tell who the wrong guy is, to be able to identify the right guy. Because if you can be able to tell who the wrong guys are, it also means that you are skilled enough to tell who the right guy is. So let me give a chance to the guest to introduce himself. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name's Chris Hart. I'm a psychologist and I write for the Sunday Nation, the Sunday Standard. I guess you've read some of my articles, and I've been counseling people in relationships and social skills for 25 years now.
Oh, thank you for telling us a little bit about yourself. And one of the things I know is that psychology is something that you studied later in life. What is it that caused you to choose that career path?
Well, to be truthful, we don't really choose our career paths, do we? At least to begin with. I mean, I studied science at school and in college because I was good at it and became an industrial chemist. And that went on until I was in my mid-30s, by which time I discovered that I didn't really like huge industrial concerns, and the way they looked at the world and what have you. And so I started thinking about becoming self-employed and becoming a professional of some sort. And after a bit of research, I chose psychology. I actually became a management consultant for about 10 years to fund the training because it takes a long time and costs a lot of money to train as a psychologist. And that's what happened. And initially, I worked in areas of trauma with victims of accidents and things of that sort and crimes. But gradually, I moved into the area of relationships and social skills, and I've been there ever since.
Okay. I think we've got quite a bit in common because I also studied Bachelor of Science Chemistry. And,
good for you.
And guess what? I do want to do psychology, not because you did it, but because I do find it very interesting, the psychological parts of humans. So today's topic is spotting Mr. Wrong. Lillian.
Yeah.
What do you think about that topic?
I think a lot of people need to hear it. And then I think I've noticed that society talks a lot to women about how to spot Mr. Wrong. And for some reason, it's not a very common conversation on how to spot Miss Wrong. Is there a reason why there's so much talk about the wrong guy more than the wrong girl or the wrong woman? Chris?
I mean, if I can jump in, I actually think they're entirely equivalent. I think both men and women have got to become skilled at choosing people who are right for them. And I emphasize the wrong bit because of a change that's occurred in society. Years ago, your great-grandmother, for example, she never knew very many people in her life. She perhaps only knew a total of 100 people who all lived very similar lives to her. And so choosing her spouse was about choosing the right person that gelled with her. And it often boiled down to things like his father owned the fields next to hers or something of that sort, But now we live in a society where we know thousands of people. We meet and interact with thousands. Many of them we only have very slight interactions with. And a numbers game starts. If you chose one of those people at random and decided you were going to date them, it would almost certainly go wrong, because your backgrounds and your experience and so on just wouldn't match. So if you simply date people at random from the mix of people you interact with, you're going to have a very bad experience. So the trick is to weed out the wrong ones as fast as possible so that you only really date and interact with the ones who've got a fighting chance. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It sort of reverses the usual idea about dating. In dating, we generally have the idea that we're looking for the right person. Actually, you're not. You're really trying to eliminate the wrong people. And that's really why I emphasize it.
So you think so you say that there are many right people and you need to choose one of them, and not that everybody is wrong and you need to pick out one right person.
Yeah, that's you couldn't have put it better. I mean, that's another problem people have when they're starting relationships. They have this idea in their head that the number of possible partners for them is very small. So in their mind, meeting somebody who is a potential partner is a major event, and you don't let them go. We force fit them quite a bit. Now, the reality is completely the opposite. There's a vast number of people out there who would love to go out with you, love to marry you for that matter. But most of them will be a bad fit, and that's nobody's fault. Okay, there are rogues out there, I don't deny it, both male and female.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of people won't gel with us, not because they're bad people, but because they just don't fit. They've got a different background, different set of interests, a different set of values, and nothing wrong in that. But unless you quickly find a person who has got a match for you, you're wasting your time.
Okay, that is very, very interesting. And you've talked about a lot of similarities. And what you're saying is very countercultural, because there's this feeling that opposites attract. But what I'm hearing you say is that somebody with common background, somebody with common interest, is it true that opposites attract, or is it a fallacy that we've come to hear so many times and believed the wrong thing?
The trouble is, opposites make good books, good TV, good films. And so you do see a lot of it. I mean, even go back to, Pride and Prejudice, written a couple of hundred years ago. They were opposites, weren't they? One was rich, the other was poor, one was proud, the other one, etc. Now, it makes for a good story, but the reality is that we are happiest with a person, a partner, who is a good fit. So they won't match us in personality. And this sounds a little bit counter to what I've just said, but there's no two ways about it. We choose partners who have got a different personality to us. But we also choose people who have a similar background, a similar level of education, similar families, all of that sort of thing needs to match.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm really curious, Anne, to dive into what are the signs of a wrong person. If you meet someone and they're trying to pursue you, or you're doing the whole coffee situationship thing, how do you know that this is not the right person and I should jump out?
Right. Let me chip in and tell me if I'm wrong, because I suspect I'm wrong. All right. Here I am. I'm a young girl. I'm working and I have this high-flying job. I'm driving and I am paying my own rent. If I meet somebody who is poor, I should just avoid them at all costs. Are we together, doctor? Or am I off?
Statistically, you should avoid them. The statistics say that if you start a relationship with somebody who is a bad match like that, then the chances of failure are very high. Now, there are exceptions. I mean, there will be the occasional high-flying executive who will start up with the penniless poet, and they'll actually be hugely successful. And people, dare I say it, will make television programs about them. because it's a good story.
Okay.
But the reality is that we get along much better if we, for example, choose someone from the world of work, because by definition they've got a job, and they're also got a similar background to you because that's how they got their job in the first place. So, for example, if you deliberately went out and started picking potential dates from bus queues, they'd probably mostly go wrong. But on the other hand, if you start drinking coffee with people you meet through the course of your working day, most of those will go right. You see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I do see.
So now you ask the question, how do you spot the wrongs? I mean, what you do in practice is you don't consciously go wrong spotting right at the beginning. You just start to have a little conversation. You make a point of talking to everybody you meet. Now, I mean, that's good practice anyway. There's a saying in psychology that every good thing that ever happens in your life starts with meeting a stranger. And if you think about that, that's true. A stranger gave you a job, a stranger became your husband, and so on. So the first thing to do is to develop the habit, develop the skills of just making small talk with everybody you interact with. Now, that small talk inevitably for working, educated people begins to sound a little bit like a networking conversation. You inevitably ask them a little bit about their job. And before you know it, you can slip in a few cheeky questions like, oh, and what does your wife do? Which establishes whether or not they've got one. And in the first 2 or 3 minutes of a little conversation like that, you've ruled most of them out because their job sounds awful, or they're married, or what have you. And you say something, like, gosh, that was nice meeting you. We must have coffee sometime, meaning don't call me. And
don't ask for my number.
Yeah, you get the idea. So you've actually done yourself a huge favor just in those first couple of minutes, because the vast majority of those people, it won't go anywhere. But just occasionally, as you're having that conversation after a meeting, the coffee goes cold and you realize that this person is actually a good fit. And so this time you give them your business card and you say, hey, let's have coffee sometime, call me. And then the whole process starts.
Okay. I think a lot of single people have done that, but they've not found a good fit. So what do you think would be the problem with someone who is probably, at marriage age, in their 30s or 40s, and they've done all the networking they could do, but for some reason, the only people they are finding are married or living far away and only here for vacation? What's going on there?
Right. In all probability, they're a victim of the numbers game. You see, if you meet people at random, roughly 1 in 100 is going to match you. This is a bit like, have a conversation with a salesperson sometime, and they'll tell you a similar sort of story, that they have to ring 100 people before they make a sale. Now, if you only actually interact with, say, 2 or 3 people in the course of a year, the chances of them being a good match for you are pretty slim. But if you met and interacted with, say, 2 or 3 a week, then over the course of a year, that would be 100 plus. And one of those will be a match. You see, that's the problem.
Yeah. You've got to meet lots and lots of people to be able to get the right one. I hear that. And, there's a term we use called Giannica. That is putting yourself out there so that you can meet people and you can be able to get the numbers game right. And I totally get that because, it's about probability. But I want us to get a little bit into details. And one thing I like about you, Dr. Hart, is that you're very open, which is a really good way of drawing people to yourself. And one of the things that you told me when I met you for the first time is that in my first marriage, and already that made me realize that you're somebody who has learned also from your own life story. Tell us a little bit about how it was for you in terms of what was it that you looked for the first time, but you were wrong and you corrected the other time. Please, let's just get into the real deep stuff right here.
That's a very cheeky question. I mean, look, my first marriage was when I was 21, and I was a classic example of somebody who married too young, because my idea of marriage in those days was, of course, what in effect was what happened to my parents, because they were my role model, if you like. And they'd had a very traditional, very old-fashioned marriage. They were farmers, and they just spent their whole lives peacefully together on a farm. And I thought that that's how marriages worked. Well, of
Like they
course,
were right for each other.
yeah, they were perfect for each other. I mean, they stayed together for 40 odd years, no, nearly 60 years. Anyway,
Wow.
that marriage actually lasted over 20 years. And so you couldn't say it was a failure. It
No, it
produced
wasn't.
2 children and so on. But it did crash after 20 years. And when I look back, I can see where the reasons were. And it was largely because she and I were a good match as students. We were both students at the time. We married while we were still in college.
Yes.
And living the penniless life of a student with the very simple responsibilities that students have and all the rest of it, we were totally great. But 20
Yeah.
years later, I was a high-flying executive and she was a teacher, and we had two sort of kids in middle childhood, and life was complicated, and all of a sudden things fell apart. So
Oh.
when I went looking for, I didn't deliberately go looking for a spouse after that.
No, I totally get it
Yeah.
completely. Yeah.
But eventually I met someone, and don't laugh, but I met them online. And somebody, Caroline, my wife, she sent a message to me asking about an article I'd written in the Sunday newspaper. And for some reason, the conversation continued. And it was a year before we met, and it was another year before anything happened. But then all of a sudden, we recognized that we were a huge match, and we've been together ever since.
Wow, that introduces something very interesting, that you can be right, you can be with the right person, but then over time, because of different interests and different paths of life,
Yeah.
sort of that changes.
Yes, I'm sorry to say that that's quite a common event.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of people have that experience. Now, um, if what happened to my first wife and I had happened to me now, I think we'd have survived, because now I have the skills for dealing with that. But we
Mhm.
parted before I started studying psychology. And to be honest, before psychology had really dug deep into this sort of problem. Now, this is the stuff of research. And, I can quote a lot of research about what I should have done. But, that was
Yeah.
20 years ago, so I didn't do it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hart, for sharing. I know that was very personal, but I
That's
thank you that
okay.
you opted to share. And let me also share a little bit of my experience as well, because I'm married and I met my husband through work. He was my client.
Mm-hmm.
I can already start to see that what you're saying is very true in terms of meeting the person, meeting the person you're with at the right level. You met in your first marriage when you were students, so
Yes.
I'm beginning to see what you're talking about and how it it plays out in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, we were, like I say, we were a good fit to begin with, but then we
Yeah.
diverged.
Okay.
That's
Okay. I
what
get it.
happens.
All right. What I'm wondering is in your view, Chris, is marriage for life? When and then is all dating for marriage? Are we talking about Mr. Wrong in marriage, or just Mr. Wrong as a friend or as a partner? And then
Sure.
is marriage also for life in your view?
Yes.
The best practice.
Sure. Well, again, there's been a big change in society. If I go back to your great grandmother again, marriage was definitely life for her. I mean, there was no other way of making a living. Two people had to join up and they had to pull together, otherwise they couldn't make a living. Life's dramatically changed for educated urban people, especially educated urban women. Nowadays, people spend quite a high proportion of their lives working lives are single, don't they? It's
Yeah, they
very
do.
uncommon for people to marry now in their really early 20s. Most people are marrying in their late 20s and early 30s.
Yes.
So they spend at least a decade, maybe even 15 years, shall we call it dating casually. In other words, they're enjoying a dating, intimate maybe relationship for the sheer pleasure of it, and for not a, shall we say, not for a lifetime purpose. But
Yeah.
what generally happens to people is that sometime after their careers have become established, they begin to start thinking differently. They begin to think about a relationship which will be permanent, and that will be something, you know, they can start a family and so on and so on. So most of us these days live our lives in two halves, our adult lives in two halves. A single half and a married half, if I can call it. They're unequal halves, obviously, hopefully. But now, I think the reason that marriage is important is that marriage is a unique relationship. If you think about all the relationships you've ever been in, including with your mother, your siblings, your wider family, your friends at school, and so on, they've all got one common characteristic, and that is that you aren't entirely truthful with any of them. We don't even tell our mothers everything, do we?
No.
Now,
Okay.
marriage is different because if you choose the right person, you can be totally trusting of one another, and you can reveal everything that's going on in your head to your spouse. And that makes that relationship something quite special. And I myself think of it as the basis of real love, you know, that you can only really love somebody that you truly trust. You can have fun with anybody. You can say you love them, but actually, truly, deeply loving somebody is a trust issue. So now, if you want that love in your life, you're only going to get it if you choose somebody and intend to be with them for life, because then you can develop that level of trust. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Now,
hear
I
you.
personally think that that is the basis of the greatest happiness in life. So, in my book, trying to get married is a good idea. Now, not everybody succeeds, not everybody wants to. There's lots of to's and fro's, but I would argue that it's a worthwhile objective.
I'm just thinking about dating or having a relationship with someone who some people are very skilled at pretending and lying, and people lie a lot. And I guess also in the urban educated.
Yep.
I agree, Lillian. Let me add to that because I feel like
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
All right. So I'm thinking about someone who is able to really clean up their act so that when they are dating, or rather, if I'm dating, this person is perfect. I can't see anything wrong with them. And it almost feels too good to be true. But then you don't want to disqualify someone because they are too good. You understand? How do you
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah.
Now, this is the Mr. Wrong bit, because after you have found somebody who is a match, in other words, their backgrounds and education and careers are at least similar to yours, you then have to start looking at their personality and values and so on. And this is where the problem of the guy who is being perfect it comes in. Now, it's easy to make promises. It's easy to say those lovely words and, you know, and I love you and all the rest of it. It's not, to be frank, you shouldn't pay much attention to any of that. If you want to know whether this is a good guy, you don't look at what he says, you look at what he does. And this is where I have the concept of what I call pink flags. Now, a red flag is something that's a total nightmare. If a red flag is somebody who hits you on the first date. You obviously don't go out on the second date. But a pink flag is the little tiny things that people do that reveal that underneath they're not quite as good as they look. So, for example, he's treating you so well, but actually he's rude to the waiter and he's nasty to the taxi driver, and he makes snide comments about your sister or something like that, before long, that it's going to be you who's at the tail end of all of that. See, so what you've seen is a little thread in his behavior that reveals a nasty streak. It doesn't have to be as overt as that. It could be much simpler. It could be that he's just telling you strange little lies, you know, and you begin to think, now, why does he need to tell me these lies? But it's revealing that there's something deep in him that you don't want to get to know better. You see what I'm driving at?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just wondering, don't we all have pink flags? Isn't there something with all of us?
Yeah, 100%. If you see just one or two of these things, then they just got a funny little personality quirk. And we, as you say, we've all got those. It's when you start to see a crowd of them that you begin to realize that this isn't a good person. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, yes, everybody can be late for the odd date, but if it starts to become consistent, and if it's tied together with the guy who disappears for a whole weekend and doesn't bother to tell you, and has a tendency to put his phone off all evening and stuff like that, slowly this is all adding up to someone you don't want to be with.
Yeah,
exactly. I hear you on that. And what happens is that we do tend to ignore a lot of those pink flags because of something we call being in love, which is something I'd like us to discuss a little later. But one of the things you mentioned that caught my attention is the issue of skill. You talked about the fact that now where you're at, in hindsight, you realize that if the skills you have now would have been able to help you navigate the challenges that resulted in the past marriage not working. Do you feel that we are skilled for relationships as human beings, or are we lacking in that area? Because we go to school and we learn chemistry, we learn math, we learn all these subjects, but we really don't. What are the skills that we need, the soft skills that we need for relationships, and where are we supposed to get them?
Yeah, well, that's the problem. I mean, do you remember that wonderful T-shirt that people used to wear a year or two ago, which said, today I haven't used algebra once, meaning that, you know, schools teach us all this stuff and then we don't use it after that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a problem. Schools teach us reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they don't teach us social skills. And if you think about the whole of our lives, they're dominated by social skills, not only just getting on with the people around us, but also how do you find a job? How do you get on well with your colleagues at work? How do you develop assertiveness? You know, all this sort of thing. And a subset of that, of course, is developing the skills to choose the right spouse and to have a good relationship when you've found them. They're not taught. There's no class in Form 4 on, you know, life skills or anything like that. There should be. I mean, we really ought to campaign for social skills training to be part of normal education. Chances of that happening, a bit slim, I would guess. But the default is that we have to teach ourselves in the course, especially our late teens and our early 20s. People teach each other social skills just by interacting in the schoolroom and all the rest of it. Now, the problem with that is that we learn a sort of default set of social skills. So, for example, the little boys learn the skills of being rather nasty to one another because a boy's life is intensely competitive. Yeah. Girls have a tendency to learn a set of nurturing skills. They're much nicer to one another, but neither of them learns the skill of talking to the opposite gender, because mostly when you're in school, you don't mix with the opposite gender that much. Now, get into college, get into work, get into the real world. You suddenly have to learn the skills of interacting with the opposite gender. And it can be tough, and some people never make it. Yeah. I mean, fortunately, there's endless newspaper articles and books to read. So
Thank
read
God.
them.
And you've got a couple. Thank you. Thank you so much.
But, you know, it is hard. The most important, if you like, the most important skill is to realize that you need those skills, is to start thinking about what's going on. And instead of sort of slagging off every girlfriend or boyfriend who doesn't meet your expectations, is to start asking yourself, why did that go wrong? What should I have done differently? And read a book to try and put you on the right track, and so on.
I like that so, so much.
Yeah.
Knowing that you don't know so that you can know now. Instead of
Yeah.
thinking you know everything. And
Absolutely.
then now you can't even, and yet when you look around you, you're seeing failures all around, but you still think everybody else is off and I'm right.
Yeah. I'm just having two thoughts right now. The first thought is, I think everybody should go for therapy at, after the age of 20 or periodically throughout their lives, because we have so much baggage that makes us be the wrong person, and sometimes even attract the wrong person. So that's the first thought I had. The second thought, I wanted to ask you, Dr. Chris, are there some relationships? I'm asking for a friend. I'm not asking for myself.
Of course, that's what we do here.
Yes. Are there some wrong relationships that are important or helpful or beneficial? For example, being intimate with your boss might be how that might be helpful to your career, or being an intimate relationship with a married person or between married people, that might be beneficial somehow. It's going nowhere, but it might help you get ahead somehow. And then both of you know that it's going nowhere, but it fulfills its purpose. Is that anything you can address?
I think particularly when people are young, sort of 18, 19, college years, first few years of work, every relationship, no matter how awful it might be, is beneficial because you're just learning relationship skills. So every time you go out with somebody and it goes pear-shaped, you've just learned some more about yourself and about judging whether or not somebody's a good fit for you and so on. So you could argue that every single relationship you ever have is like that you learn something from every bad relationship as well as every good one. Okay. Now, some of the relationships you just described, of course, are nightmares.
Quite.
If start sleeping with your boss, and you can be pretty sure that fans are going to start whirling and brown stuff is going to be sprayed everywhere. It really is going to be a very bad situation. So, if we're wise, we steer clear of things like that. Now, sometimes people find themselves in such relationships almost by accident. Try and avoid them if you can, because generally speaking, statistically they don't work out. But in general, though, it's a good maxim in life is that we learn from every failure, and that's true in relationships as well as everywhere else.
Yeah. Another thing, what I'm hearing you say, Dr. Hart, is that contrary to what we've been taught and raised, a person who's had sort of many relationships, not that they are bad, has got more experience with relational stuff. And this whole thing about trying to look for a virgin, for example, when you're a man.
Yes.
And a virgin mostly means that this is the first person you're going out with. Honestly, is that someone to avoid? Like, if I'm 35 and I'm meeting you and I'm your first girlfriend, should I run away or should I be wild that I'm the first one? What do you think?
Right. I think it is helpful for people to have some, let us call them trial relationships early in their lives in order that they learn relationship skills. I don't see any way round that. If you do meet a couple who have been each other's firsts, they were both virgins when they got married, they have a tendency to form what I call fragile relationships, because the chances are they've met and got into their relationship, and so long as everything goes smoothly, there's no problem. But they haven't learned conflict skills because they haven't had any bad relationships, so that when something does go wrong, suddenly they can't cope with it. And the truth of the matter is, of course, that something always goes wrong in life. As our lives get more complex, as we have children and aged parents to look after, and you name it, things go wrong. Now, if you haven't got the skills for dealing with those, there's a very good chance that your relationship will blow up. Now, that first relationship of mine falls into that category. I hate to say it, very revealing. We were both virgins, and we had a relationship where things didn't go wrong. But when they did go wrong, we couldn't cope. We just simply didn't have the skills.
Because all of life has been so good and so rosy, and so it's like your bubble crashes and you sort of crash with it, you know?
Yeah, that's entirely right. Whereas if you've had the sort of life which is quite common now, where for 10 years or more you've had a series of relationships which have all crashed for some reason or other, if nothing else, you've at least learned how to hold an argument and how to try and make a positive result out of it, and so on.
Yeah, and that is something, how to hold an argument, how to conflict with somebody and still go on. You know, like, you know, we're noticing a lot of this in our society, Chris, I must say. You know, a boy meets a girl and the girl says no, and the boy wants to end his life. And these are just people in their early 20s, and you're like, come on, there are so many girls out there. Why are you feeling that only if one says no, that it's the end of the world? And there are so many, you know, people need to realize that it is a game of numbers. And if one says no, the pool is still open. There's still so many people.
Yes.
Yeah. Although, well, to be very honest, sometimes you know, I also we have viewers who are already, you know, what if you marry the wrong person, for example?
Yeah.
And you realize 1 or 2 years later, because another thing is that Lillian had asked later is that when you're dating, people do tend to be very deceptive, and not intentionally. Everybody is putting their best foot forward. So a lot of things, sometimes you don't quite see them, and when you do, you ignore them because you're in love. Those chemicals are raging all over your body. What can you do when you're in it? Is there anything you can do, like just live with these pink flags, or is it over and you're going to be unhappy all your life? Or
look, you know, we only have one life, so it should not be unhappy. So if you find yourself in a relationship which is clearly wrong, not working at all, first of all, you've got to do something about it. Now, in practice, what that means is that you've got two possible paths to follow. You might be able to sort the relationship out. You might be able to talk with your spouse, and maybe with some professional help, and you can fix whatever's going wrong. If you can do that, of course, that's the preferred option. But maybe they won't respond. Maybe they can't respond. Maybe you don't want to respond. Then you have the other alternative, which is you leave and you start again. What you mustn't do is spend the next 25 years miserable, because, you know, the one thing you don't want to be is a little old lady who's spitting fire at everybody because she's had a horrible life, you know?
Spitting fire, I like that.
Yeah.
It happens a lot.
The thing we always forget is that when we walk down towards the altar, we're actually planning to have grandchildren together. Now, a life in that relationship has to be a good one. So I know it sounds a bit melodramatic and maybe even defeatist, but if in the first couple of years it's clear that actually things are not working, it really is better to move on. I know that sounds awful, but it is.
Yeah, it sounds very counter.
Yeah, it is.
But you know,
I mean, in a perfect world, you made a perfect choice and you're right for one another. But if for some reason that doesn't work out, then don't waste the rest of your life saying, "Oh, I'm just staying around for the children," or whatever, or because your family wants you to, or something. It's awful if, you just don't want to do that.
At what point do you know that now I've waited enough for this thing to change, and it's time for me to move on?
Well, I think the first thing is, if you realize something's wrong, the first thing you've got to do is to articulate it first to yourself. You've got to actually sit and think and decide what is wrong. Now, that sounds a bit trivial when I say it quickly, but it's awfully easy to be in a relationship where you're constantly frustrated and irritable and all the rest of it, and you're sort of blaming it on your spouse. And actually, it might be that the real cause of all of this is inside you and your own personal frustrations. So the starting point is to be more analytical about why you're unhappy. When you have figured out where the cause of your unhappiness is, and let us assume that it is partly your spouse, then, of course, you need to articulate that to them. You need to, instead of saying, I hate you, you've got to say, hey, I'm feeling bad. Can we sit down and talk about what we can do about that? Now, that conversation often goes quite well. So after you've had those two activities, you've thought through what's wrong, you've articulated it to yourself and to your spouse. If you still can't make any progress at all, that's the point at which you need to think about leaving.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
I see what you mean. And another thing that I want us to talk about is sometimes when you're the one in the relationship, you cannot spot that you're with a Mr. Wrong, but sometimes you have a lot of friends and a lot of family who keep telling you, girl, this is the wrong person. But you're like, these people don't like me, and you start isolating them and not talking to them. What do you think about that? Is it that they're jealous, or is it that they're genuinely seeing something that I'm not?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's the latter. Our friends often know a lot more about us than we do. It's a real true thing. It happens because a lot of what drives our behavior is subconscious. You think about, for example, you're walking down the street having a conversation with someone. You don't actively think much about the act of walking, do you? It's all being managed subconsciously. And as you interact with other people, a great deal of what determines your behavior with them is subconscious. And our subconscious behavior reveals our feelings in the way we behave. But our conscious mind isn't aware of it. But our friends are, because they see the behaviors, you see. So our friends often end up having a much better insight into what's driving our behavior than we do. Our conscious mind tends to make up stories about what we do. It doesn't really have a connection to the subconscious. And often we're bad at making up those stories. And so we have these theories about, oh, I'm unhappy because my spouse is whatever, But our friends can see that it's all our fault. So when our friends tell us things about ourselves or our relationship, we should listen. We should listen really hard because they know more about us than we do.
Okay. Dr. there are these types of personalities that are very good. They have very good presentation skills. So when they're in church and at work and outside in public,
yes,
A plus.
Yeah, they're perfect. But when they're at home, the spouse and the children are like, they know someone totally different. So even if the spouse tries to change, or even if they go for marriage counseling, this spouse or this partner is constantly being told, no, you should stay with this person. Do you know how many people would want to be with such a person? And so everybody is telling one spouse to stay with the other spouse. So what happens when you are on your own in terms of wanting to exit the situation?
Yes.
That's the reverse of the question you're from answering.
Yes.
First of all, friends tend to sleep,
Sorry, say that again.
I say now, if you ignore your friends and marry the wrong person, now when you want to leave the wrong person, the same friends, they want you to remain in the relationship.
Yes.
So it's very confusing.
It is confusing. Yeah. But
I don't know if
that situation you've described is quite common. We all play different roles in different parts of our lives. So you play a different role when you're with your mother, when you're with your boss, when you're being ticked off by a policeman. You're a different person, aren't you? And you're a different person when you're with your spouse. And a lot of the problems that arise between people are more intense between spouses, because if I'm disagreeing with a colleague at work, I can just walk away. But if I'm disagreeing with my spouse, it hurts because they're supposed to love me, and yet here they are having a row with me. So everything gets more intense. So it's very common for people to be a different sort of person at home than they are everywhere else. Now, the one good news associated with that, the one bit of good news, is that clearly they can change. So in other words, if I start talking to my spouse about why I'm feeling unhappy, they clearly have the potential to change because they're treating other people in the way that I want to be treated. So it's worth having the conversation with a spouse in that situation. Somebody who, for example, is maybe they're much too controlling at home. Maybe what they're doing is they're a boss at work, and so they're used to controlling everybody, and they come home and they control me. Well, you can talk to somebody about that. Yeah. It's only after you've exhausted that conversation that you start thinking about leaving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It does.
You make it sound all too simple. Very honest.
Yeah, it sounds very
You make it sound too simple. And the drama we see out here is very complicated.
It's interesting you say that. The big problem with relationships is that there's a lot of noise. In everyday relationships, there's an awful lot going on. And so having the time and the peace to analyze what the root cause of an issue is actually very hard work. And that's why people talk to counselors, because if you can peacefully talk to somebody you trust, you often can find those root causes. And then, of course, when you go back to your relationship with the root cause in your mind, hey, suddenly it gets fixed. Yeah. So in principle, relationships are relatively straightforward to fix. But for most people, it's very hard because we're distracted by all the things that are going on around us all the time. And the little moods we're in, and the kids screaming at us, and the bills piling up. It's very hard to keep a clear mind in a situation like that. Yeah. And that's why counseling is so effective, you see. You take a whole hour to just sit peacefully with one person and talk about nothing but your issues. It's not surprising that you start to find solutions, is it?
And you get clarity.
Yeah.
I read somewhere that victims of abuse, and of course, we should talk about abuse because it's Mr. Wrong or Miss Wrong. Victims of abuse usually don't leave until the 7th incident of abuse. I don't know if that's around the world or just in Africa, because I feel in Africa, marriage is really, put on a very high pedestal. So say somebody has gone through the first incident of abuse, maybe after 2 or even 5 years of staying together, something substantial, like after 5 years.
The problem is that abuse fits 2 distinct patterns. Some people abuse their partners because they have personality disorders, for example. If you are fortunate, you can spot those long before you begin to think about marriage. So people who abuse their partners because of personality issues, for example, they're narcissists or have antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
People like that you should avoid, because those people have little or no ability to change their behavior. There's a second type of abuse that occurs violent abuse that occurs in relationships. And that is anger driven by stress, for example, and frustration and all the other things that pile up in life. Now, mostly that's curable. So the first thing you should do if there is an abusive incident inside a relationship is to speak up and get help and find out what the problem is, find out which of those 2 categories that it fits in, And to be blunt, if you are married to a psychopath, then you'll be advised to leave, and so you should do it straight away. And if you're in the other category, you'll be advised on how to work together to reduce such incidents. You see what I mean? But what you mustn't do is just stay in the relationship, doing nothing, putting up with the abuse. Now, there's nothing magic about 7 incidents or something like that. What really happens is that abuse tends to fall into a cycle. They call it the cycle of abuse. And what happens is there's a big blow up, there's a big incident, somebody gets hurt. The next day, everybody is terribly apologetic and everybody makes up and the promises are made. And for a few weeks, everything's very quiet and very loving. And then slowly the stress starts to rise again. And before you know it, you're walking on eggshells. And before you know it, there's been a repeat. Yeah. And then the cycle goes around again. And each time you think that was the last time.
Yeah.
And now that's the thing you must recognize is happening in your relationship. And the critical thing is get help. It's very hard for a couple in which abuse is occurring. It's very hard for them to deal with it on their own. It really is important to go and talk to some sort of professional. It could be a priest, it could be a counselor, it could be a really trusted friend. But what you mustn't do is cover it up and pretend it isn't happening, which is what a lot of people do.
Yeah. And then it blows up in a bad
eventually.
way.
Yes, eventually.
And when it does that, there's even no room to track back. It just blows up and you can't even tell what the issue was in the first place.
That's really deep. I think for me, I don't know if it's a bother or what I would say it is, but I find that in Africa, even a counselor would even tell you to stay and wait for the person to change. You know what I mean? Especially in Christian or in a religious setting, a lot of counselors will say, they'll teach you how to try and walk on the eggshells. They say, they'll give you walking on eggshell skills instead of you to start planning your exit. Have you seen that, Daktari? Have you seen that?
Yes, actually, Lillian, I've had someone who is a comedian. He talks about marriage and he says men change. They change after a long time and immediately they change shortly after they die.
I mean, the real problem is this, that if you do nothing, then nothing changes. And so if something is wrong in a relationship, at whatever level, whether it's just frustrating or really dangerous, you must address the issue or it won't change. And so you might argue that the key relationship skill is actually assertiveness, the willingness to sit down with your partner and say, hey, I'm not happy. We need to work on whatever it is and get it right. Now, in general, if you're assertive in a relationship, you end up getting what you want. And the big mistake is not to speak up.
Yeah. I must say that time has run out and we really have to wrap up the show. But in a very short way, Dr. Chris, tell us, is it possible to have a good relationship with people who are, for example, alcoholics or drug addicts? Because I see that happening a lot. And you wonder, is that a red flag or a pink flag or not a flag? Does it work sometimes?
Right. In general, people who have issues like alcohol are very difficult to deal with. And the common thread in that is that they won't agree that there is a problem. You talk to most people who drink and they'll tell you, me, an alcoholic? No, I just like having a chat with my friends, If you can get somebody who's dealing with an issue like that to face up to reality and to deal with the issue, there's no problem at all. But more times than not, they refuse. And therein lies the issue. I mentioned earlier people with personality difficulties. Psychology has all the tools for dealing with psychological disorders, for personality disorders, and so on. But these people won't agree that there is a problem. So they won't accept treatment. A lot of alcoholics won't accept treatment. So if you're with someone who won't accept that there's a problem, then the chances of success are very limited. But if you can once get them to say, okay, I get it, I really do need to do something about this, then you're just the same as any other couple. You can fix it.
Wow. I think that's a very good way of concluding the show. And Lillian, we need to wrap up the show. So let's give the doctor an opportunity to give a parting shot. And then I think we may need to invite him again, because personality disorders is something we need to talk about. I don't think people know about that much.
Yeah.
Please give us a parting shot, and then it's time to say goodbye.
Well, the most important thing I would like to say is something I said earlier in the show, which is that marriage is a unique relationship, which has the potential to be the happiest part of your entire life. So it is worth aiming to get married, and it is worth putting a lot of effort into choosing the right person and then developing the skills to make it a good relationship. It's a seriously worthwhile thing to do. I know people are deeply cynical about relationships and marriages these days, but what I've just said, I think, remains true, that it's worth the effort.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing all those nuggets of wisdom with us. And we look forward to having another show. And we're going to be reaching out to you once again once we get lots of comments and questions. So Lillian, please wrap the show for us.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you so much, Daktari. It's been such a pleasure. We look forward to having you again. And to everyone who's watching, stay tuned to the rest of the programming and have yourself a good day. Bye.